Hello everyone, welcome to Global Compliance Panel live webinar on developing an effective supplier and internal auditing system. My name is Ron and I'm going to be a host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of this event. Today's webinar will be presented by Jeff Kassoff. A few words about Jeff before we could start off today's session. Jeff, RACCQM, is the Director of Quality at NetZealous, a leading manufacturer of endoscopy, consumables, and instrumentation. In his 20-plus years career in quality and regulatory affairs, he has implemented and overseen CAPA systems and has been FDA liaison for and participated in dozens of FDA inspections. Jeff has prepared responses to 483s and warning letters and participated in face-to-face meetings with FDA officials. Jeff received his Regulatory Affairs certification in the year 1996 and his Quality Management certification in the year 2013. We are honored to have such a distinguished person such as Jeff with us to present today's webinar. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I'd like to inform you of the program outline for this training session. This webinar is for 60 minutes duration. First, Jeff will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that would be covered, and he will then share with you his presentation. And I would also like to inform all participants, once you're part of this teleconference, your calls will be placed on mute and would remain so until the Q&A begins towards the end of the webinar. Now, this is just for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity and for allowing our presenter to speak clearly. I also request all to hold back your questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 minutes of your time will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered by Jeff. Now, if for any reason you get logged out of this training session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. And now that we're all ready to start, I request Jeff to take it from here. Jeff?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Ron. Let me welcome everybody to this webinar. For those of you who have not attended webinars before, I really think that the only detriment, the only downside that you're going to experience is, quite honestly, that I can't see you and you can't see me. The way I like to address that is at the end of the session, we'll certainly have a Q&A session to part. But if you feel that you would prefer to have an exchange of dialogue, give and take, just a discussion as opposed to a question and answer session, let's do that. My goal here is to meet the requirements of each of our attendees. As the title says, today's webinar is about putting together supplier auditing schemes, systems, if you will, and internal auditing schemes. They're grouped together due to the criticality of their importance. But to a large extent, there is quite a difference between an effective internal audit system and an effective supplier system. The first example of many that we'll speak about during this presentation is that it is required to perform internal audits. It is not required to perform supplier audits. And I'll just leave you with that little tidbit as we start to move forward. Contrary to the title of the webinar, which is Supplier and Internal Auditing Systems, I'd like to begin with internal auditing. I think it behooves us to spend a little, to begin with, and spend a little more time on the regulatorily required section of the audit process. And for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to assume that the reason you're here is because you either are desiring to implement an internal auditing and supplier auditing system, or the one you have has been judged to be woefully inadequate by either yourselves internally or by perhaps a company that's purchased you, or in the worst possible case scenario, an external agency, such as your ISO notified body or the FDA. I want to begin by sort of spelling out what the regulatory requirements are. 21 CFR 820.22 is conveniently titled Quality Audit. Interesting that it's not titled Internal Audit. But as you can see, And yeah, as you can see, as we define each of these requirements, and I'll mention to you, based on my experience, is that this is the section of the regulation that the FDA inspector looks at when they're going to quantify the extent to which you have implemented an effective internal audit system. The first requirement is that you have a procedure. Most firms have an SOP or what have you, but there's got to be a governing procedure that speaks to your quality audits. And within that procedure, there has to be requirements that you meet that are contained in there. Among these requirements are the frequency of audit, the format of your audit. We'll talk about this in a little more detail, but how you audit is going to be something that you have to push to. Let's talk about FDA, since this is an FDA regulation here. How you audit is going to be have to be something that you justify to the FDA inspector. Many firms audit to the QSIT, the Quality Systems Inspection Technique, which is a guidance document that governs how the FDA performs their audits. Other firms choose to audit to the ISO subsystem in ISO 13485, section by section. It's entirely up to you, but your procedure has to spell out how you audit. Make sure, however, that if you are FDA regulated, as the overwhelming majority of us are, that you cover each aspect, each of the subsections of 21 CFR, and additionally, if you are ISO certified, that you bring in the sections of ISO 1345 that may not be covered explicitly covered, that is, in 21 CFR. We're required to have these procedures, and these procedures are required to, that require us to conduct the audits with whatever frequency you determine. I can tell you based on my experience, any less frequently than annual will result in an observation on a Form 483. The FDA's perception is that if you don't touch each of your subsystems over the course of a 12-month period, then you're not performing effective internal audits. I can't tell you whether they'll look at 9 months or 6 months, but I can tell you anything less than a frequency of annually or every 12 months is something that the inspector will not look upon favorably. Just want to distinguish here between every year and every 12 months. Make sure your procedure is clear. What many of us have is an internal audit scheme that encompasses between January and December, and that's okay. But what that requires me to do is touch everything in that period. If I say everything will be audited in a 12-month period, I've got to make sure that if I audit, let's say, corrective and preventive action in February of year 1, I better audit it January or February of year 2. Because if I audit it in February of year 1 and April of year 2, I have not audited it in a 12-month period. So if you whatever you specify, make sure that your audit plan, which you must document, meets that requirement. When it comes to the performance of audits, who is going to audit perform your internal audits? In some instances, firms have an internal audit person or group. That's what they do. They are part of, in most cases, the regulatory department, and they perform audits of all of the other areas, subsystems of the company. However, someone else other than they, sorry for the grammar error, must perform an internal audit on the internal audit program. That's something that, in my experience, may be overlooked, that you've got to audit the auditors also. In smaller companies have individuals, multiple individuals, who are certified internal auditors, and they take turns auditing each area. If you're a smaller company of, let's say, 50 people, and you have R&D, manufacturing, and QA, then you want one person, at least one person from each department, to be a certified auditor to audit the departments that they're not involved in. Having said that, though, if you look at the wording within the reg, it states that the audits must be conducted by individuals who do not have direct responsibility for the matters being audited. So what some even smaller firms choose to do is to say that we understand that complaint investigation is performed by, let's say, the quality assurance department, but we're going to have one of our quality engineers who has no responsibility for complaint handling or investigation or corrective action perform the internal audit on complaint handling. Again, the person is in that department, but they do not have any responsibility or any participation for the matters being audited. So make sure that if you're small enough that you want to implement a system such as that, that you have taken these types of things into account. The quality, when in response to a nonconformance in a quality audit, we've got to take corrective action. So we'll talk a little more about this later, but what I'd like to do now is make it a point to illustrate, to state that when it comes to the audit report, which is the next bullet point here, the audit report usually contains the area audited, a list of the nonconformances, and the individuals to whom these investigations were assigned. Something of note is that the FDA has no, I don't want to say right, that's not the word I mean. During the FDA, during an FDA inspection, the audit report is outside the scope of their purview, which means that you are well within your obligations and responsibilities to tell the internal audit, the ISO, not so much ISO, FDA inspector, that you're not going to show them the audit report. But you do need to illustrate two things: that particular areas have been audited, and many firms choose to put together an FDA-specific certification. We'll talk about that more later. But also, going back here to corrective action, you've got to show them that corrective actions that are assigned and that are assigned based on the root cause investigation during internal audits are taken when necessary. The way I've historically put this together is on my ECO, or the document that states the change that is being made, let's say, for example, to my CAPA procedure, my corrective and preventive action procedure. On the justification or reason for cause on my ECO, I will write corrective action in response to finding number 6 from internal audit of CAPA system. So I am illustrating corrective action on a discoverable document without going into detail about what that finding was. The FDA understands that they want you to perform internal audits, and they want you to perform internal audits before they note the nonconformances. So they took the step of excluding these audit reports from their purview during their inspections. Having said that, though, I have been in at least 2 inspections, 2 FDA inspections over my career. Admittedly, one was when I was kind of raw in the area, in which the FDA inspector did ask to see the audit reports. And instead of telling them, just as an aside, when you're dealing with the FDA and they ask for something that you don't have or feel that you don't need to show them the document that you've prepared that addresses that. So what I did in these situations was I said, well, here's my audit certification that each of the areas over the 12-month period have been audited, and that's what we went with. There is a requirement that the audit reports be reviewed by management. So the question you need to ask yourself is is that manager level, is it director level, or is it above? The way many firms illustrate compliance with this requirement is by including audit reports, admittedly audit summary reports, during their management review. That's clearly management, and I believe that's what the intent of this requirement is, that there can be no more plausible deniability, that senior and executive management cannot say, we didn't know about these nonconformances, because there is a regulatory requirement that they be aware of those. And the results of the audits and the date of the audit must be documented. Of course, in order to show that you have performed an audit, you've got to go ahead and document when it was done, what the results were, and equally importantly, of course, who performed the audit. In determining your audit teams, what most firms choose to do, and I wholeheartedly recommend you do the same, is have audit teams. It's very challenging for one individual to perform most, if not all, of your audits. You're going to want to have an audit team. Even larger companies who have internal auditors have more than one internal auditor, and they either alternate or they do it together. Whichever you prefer, make sure you have multiple individuals that are your certified auditors. So your procedure has got to define certain things about your audit team. The first thing is, who determines the audit team? Where is it documented who the internal auditors are for a particular function or subsystem? And then where is that documented? Most firms in their SOP for internal auditing reference their audit plan, which is a document which illustrates, which contains the audit teams for each area, and that's where the audit teams are documented. Not required, but recommended is to have a lead auditor and an assistant auditor during your internal audits. And this helps a lot because in situations where there's no distinction or two lead auditors, which is often the same thing, both people are peppering the auditee with questions at the same time. And it's difficult for somebody not to feel intimidated, even by coworkers, during situations like this. So when you designate what the responsibilities of the audit team members are, you want to illustrate, you want to designate what the responsibilities of the lead auditor are, and what the responsibilities of the assistant auditor are. In most times, the lead auditor is the primary source of interaction. He or she writes the audit report. Just as an illustration of different things that in my experience the lead auditor does. The assistant auditor, for the most part, is only present during the audit and perhaps reviews the final audit report to see if the lead auditor may have omitted anything inadvertently. Some firms choose to implement a chairperson of an internal audit program. In some cases, it's called the senior internal auditor. Whatever, if you decide to go this route, which is a good route because in my opinion, every critical program needs a chairperson. Complaint committee, corrective and preventive action committee. If you don't have a chairperson, if you don't have a senior individual, sometimes there's a bit of confusion as far as the responsibilities of each member. So the chairperson in this situation has responsibility for oversight of the entire program. They are the senior auditor in most cases, and they've been involved in the most audits because one of their responsibilities is to review the audit reports. There are going to be situations where even though you're all at the same company, usually for larger companies, but not necessarily, in some situations you have somebody from regulatory who may have a less than in-depth knowledge or awareness of the product, performing an internal audit on the manufacturing area, maybe production or process control, and their audit finding is disputed, let's be honest, by the director of manufacturing. You need a third party to determine the validity of the audit findings. When it comes to FDA and our ISO notified body, there are formal dispute procedures in place that enable us to document our contentions, and then a third-party person rules on that. To have something like that in place with regard to your internal audits really helps to facilitate the process of validity of the internal audit findings. The chairperson should also select the audit teams. In situations where you're a smaller company and perhaps there's only 3 auditors in your 3-department company, it becomes a little easier. The audit schedule should also be issued in advance of each of the 12-month periods or years. Again, if you go calendar year, you want to make sure that the audit schedule is issued during December at the latest. And if you do a 12-month period, you want to make sure that the audit schedule, in these situations, the audit schedule can be a living document, but you want to make sure that somebody is responsible to assure that each of the subsystems is audited every 12 months, that anything that's delayed is still within the 12-month window. Also, tracking audit closure. What is the status of this particular internal audit for firms that have 4 to 6 internal auditors auditing perhaps 13 to 15 different subsystems? There are situations where the audit may not be performed on time or not closed on time, or the corrective action requests might not be issued on time or responded to on time. There's a lot involved in the performance of the audit that require tracking to make sure that we're staying on our schedule. Also, distributing and filing audit reports. To not have somebody whose responsibility is to know where all the internal audit reports are and distribute them if necessary. In my experience over the last 5 to 7 years, in most situations there's a directory in which the internal audits reside, and it's on the intranet, read-only for the most part, so there's a little less distribution than there used to be. But if you decide to distribute your internal audit reports, even via email, somebody has to have the responsibility to do that. And communicating our results to senior management. If you choose to do this during your management review, again, highly recommended. Somebody has to feed this data to the management review. And the chairperson, again, or senior internal auditor is the best person to do this. They're the person who understands what executive management wants to and needs to see during the management review. I mentioned several slides ago that you need to distinguish what the responsibilities of the lead and assistant auditors are. These are a few examples of what I've seen in various procedures. As I said earlier, the lead auditor conducts the audit while the assistant auditor participates in the audit. Anything you document in your procedure has to be true. However, if you decide to have the assistant auditor review the audit report after the lead auditor writes it, that's okay. You don't need to require it, but you can still do it. The lead auditor also has to verify the closure of the corrective actions. Certainly, you'll have the chairperson or senior internal auditor overseeing the whole process, but the lead auditor's responsibility is that audit. Performing the audit is merely one part of the actual audit itself. You have to plan the audit, perform the audit, document the audit, document the nonconformances in the form of corrective actions, and then track the status of the corrective actions. So you've got to make sure that you distinguish whose responsibility that is. I recommend the lead auditor. And then the audit closure. When is the audit closed? When have all the corrective actions been responded to? And you've got to make sure that the lead auditor is on top of that. There are other responsibilities in addition to those of the auditors. For example, in most cases, managers or above are issued the noncompliances, the observations or whatever you call them. You have to make sure that if your procedure requires a period of time in which the noncompliances must be responded to, that the managers have been trained on that procedure and understand it, so they can provide the prompt responses to the noncompliances and the prompt corrections also. The manager's responsibility is not over when he or she responds to the noncompliance and says, this is what I'm going to do and this is by when I'm going to do it. They've got to correct those and implement those corrections as well. Senior management, they have a responsibility. They've got to make sure that they review audit reports and any trends if necessary. What I like to have provided to me during management review is not just the audit reports for the year, but also if there have been any repeat findings from previous years that suggests that my corrective action may not have been effective. When it comes to training your auditors, Obviously, you want to set forth the requirements and your procedures. Internal auditors have to be trained. The extent to which they're trained is up to you. If you decide to distinguish between the training requirements, some firms have the class of lead auditors and a class of assistant auditors that have different training levels. You've got to make sure that your lead auditors, or your auditors, if you don't distinguish, have external training, or at least traceable training. So if I had external training, I'd want to make sure that as part of that training, I was trained on how to train on internal audits. It's problematic at best for me to be able to say I attended an ISO 1345 external training session, and based on that, I can train others on internal auditing. That's really difficult. If you want to distinguish, you may say that I am only training the assistant auditors, just the people who are participating in the Q&A section, the interview section of the internal audits. That's what our policy, if you decide to go to the trial court, that's what our policy states. As part of the internal audit program itself, when it comes to administering it, you've got to make sure that you determine the scope of each audit. There are different mindsets involved in this that I urge you to consider when you're determining the scope, of each of the audits. You could have fewer audits, in which case you have one annual audit of the entire quality system. It's going to take a week or two because you have to touch every single subsystem of your process, of your quality system. The pro to this is you only have one audit team. The con is, as I mentioned earlier, it takes a long period of time, but many companies want to do this. Usually it's the last week during the year. I've seen that quite a bit. When there's a little less going on, many people take off for Christmas and the holidays. I've seen this done as a week-long internal audit of everything going on in, of the entire quality system. On the other hand, you may prefer shorter audits, in which case each audit just does one subsystem. Well, the pro is that it's more manageable, but on the other hand, multiple audits involve multiple inconveniences, and that's a word that if you're not already experienced with it with regard to an internal audit program, you certainly will be. It's difficult to train. It's easy to train auditors on how to audit. It's more difficult to train executive management, senior management, and the like to say, even though that person is your production manager, they are a certified internal auditor, and therefore equivalent to their responsibilities as production manager are their responsibilities in internal audit performance. So if you go the fewer audits route and you account for 1 week during the year that production manager will be performing internal audit, as opposed to that same production manager being involved in 3 audits over the course of a year, 3 to 4, maybe 5 or 6 audits over the course of a year, and it takes multiple bites out of their normal time. So whichever you go with is up to you. I've seen it done both ways. The pros and cons don't lead me to recommend either way. If I were pushed, I would recommend actually the fewer audits, 1 inconvenience, 1 time, 1 report. It's easy to do it that way. Also, if you go the shorter audits, to some extent you may have repetition. Document control, for example, while it is a subsystem, that's going to be reviewed during each of the other subsystem reviews. Corrective or preventive action often results in corrective actions that require ECOs to change documents. Complaint handling, another subsystem that's often audited by itself, may result in investigations that result in design changes that result in ECOs. So you're going to touch document control throughout. When you determine the scope of each audit, you're going to have to determine how you audit. And there are normally two schools of thought. The first one is auditing to the ISO subsystem. The thing I don't like about this is that it's not very, what you can see on the slide that I like to call digestible. Product realization, for example, is one of the ISO subsystems. It's 5 pages long, small type. Measurement analysis improvement, 6 pages. It's difficult to divide these, to separate them into auditable, manageable areas. Again, I've seen it done. I know that it can be done, but it's a little work. In my experience, and I hate to draw conclusions based on a little less data than I would like, the larger companies that have internal audit departments or functions perform to ISO subsystems because they have the time and can put the work in to separate that into manageable areas. If you're a smaller company, perhaps you don't have an internal audit function, but you have internal auditors from each of your areas. These firms tend to use the QSIT a little more, the Quality Systems Inspection Technique. It already has subsystems. Here's the web address for it. It's 108 pages. It's not short, but it has sampling tables, it has rationales, and the FDA doesn't question you when you audit to the document that they audit to as well. Repetition here, I apologize for that. Again, as I mentioned a second ago, when you perform internal audits to the QSIT, you have a sampling table list, and it tells you, for example, during complaints, look at this during complaint investigation, auditing, excuse me, look at this many complaints. If you see problems, look at some more. Look at device history records. If you see nonconformances, now move into the nonconforming handling section of the internal audit. Another benefit of auditing to QSIT is that you're already going to have reviewed the subsystems that are going to be reviewed during an FDA inspection. So from a subject matter perspective, you're familiarizing yourself with what the inspector will ask. I think it goes without saying during internal audits, the more you find, the less the FDA will find. And to the same extent also, it asks the same questions. And from a non-material but more practical personnel-based perspective, the people know what to expect during the FDA inspection. Sure, it's their buddy Jeff asking them these questions right now, but when Jeff asks him those questions and they respond, 8 months later, when an FDA inspector asks them, they're going to remember the questions from when Jeff asked them. They're going to remember what their response was. And when I perform internal audits, and in my opinion, the good internal auditors do this, is if I audit to QSIT and I ask a question and their answer is perhaps speculative or in another manner contrary to how they should respond to FDA, I let them know that. I'm there not just to look for objective evidence, but we're coworkers. We want our internal audit system to succeed, and we want to find noncompliances. I'm more than happy to reach out to each person, whom I audit, and let them know what they should have said, a better response. Another benefit is that senior management knows what the audit requirements are, because during an audit, the auditors have to have access to senior management. You want senior management to know the questions that the FDA is going to ask them, because I don't want to say all, pretty much all of the FDA inspections in which I've been involved, they have asked for access to senior management. Usually not above the director level, but I've seen it go all the way up to the executive VP. And you want to make sure that your even senior management knows what questions are going to be asked during the FDA inspection. Some firms recruit their executive management out of industry other than medical device or pharma. And those people need to understand what an FDA inspection entails. If you go the QSIT route, my experience shows that the FDA inspection does proceed with fewer problems. certainly the FDA inspection goes much, much more in depth than an internal audit, which usually pretty much just skims the surface and then trusts each of the nonconformance assignees to perform the further in-depth analysis by themselves. But it does, anytime we can find out what the questions are that we're going to be asked, we can answer them better the second time. That goes without saying. Just to clarify on a few other things, the audit schedule has to be issued annually, either annually or before or as part of your 12-month, in advance of your 12-month period. It's got to be generated and maintained. Generated is pretty straightforward. It's going to be, usually what I've seen is the audit committee chairperson or senior internal auditor issues the audit schedule for the year, and it's signed by the director or VP of quality or regulatory, just to show that it's been reviewed and approved. There are situations in which you may want to revise the audit committee, but make sure that, revise the audit schedule. But when you do this, you have to make sure that you have any necessary approvals and that any subsystems that you're putting off any period of time continue to be assessed within a 12-month period. It's very difficult, and I've had audit findings where I audited one area January of one year and then October of the following year. That's, I can't do the math in my head. That's probably 20 some odd months. That's probably about 16 to 18 months in which a particular subsystem did not undergo internal audit. The contents of the audit schedule, pretty straightforward. What area you're auditing, who's auditing it, and when they're scheduled to audit. That's it. It's okay to have it, when it comes to audit date, it's okay to have it by month. March of 2014, we're going to perform internal audits on the production and process control subsystem. Doesn't need to say whether that it's March 2nd or 9th. And quite honestly, it gives you a little bit of leeway to know that you need to audit it in March. So guess what? If you want to audit that, if you want to begin your plan in February to be able to enable you to audit it early March, that's great. Don't make the mistake of saying, oh, I have till March, so I'm going to begin my audit planning, I don't know, maybe halfway through the month. Something always comes up, especially in situations where you have an internal audit team that is from multiple departments, and somebody says that you need to do your primary job or something like that. In some cases, when it's your boss, you're going to actually do exactly that, but you still have a responsibility to perform internal audits. We all do. As I said, either every 12 months or annually. I prefer the concept of 12 months. It requires a little more tracking, but it's I don't want to say defendable, because if you have to have a position that is, I think this will be defendable, or it is defendable, you're starting out negotiation from a position of weakness. If you say yes, each area subsystem is audited every 12 months and you can show it, there's no more discussion that's necessary. And the audit schedule also acts as the tracking mechanism. Your audit schedule will be updated as your audits are performed to show, if you have an Excel spreadsheet, for example, that as February ends, you change the audit of your CAPA subsystem from let's say yellow, which means hasn't been performed, to green. So each month, if you go in this manner, you update the audit schedule to be more of an audit report or something that shows that internal audits are being performed. In advance of the audit, you've got to take a few minutes. You've got to make sure that the lead auditor schedules the audit. For me to send an email Monday that I'm going to be performing an internal audit of production and process control Wednesday through Friday, that might not work out. I like to schedule it weeks in advance to make sure that that individual knows that we're coming. Also, during prep, you want to set up the questions. If you internal audit, as I've said, to the QSIT system, it enables you to set up questions because they're there and determine sample quantities. They're there as well. You want to make sure that in preparation, the area manager or supervisor or other personnel frees up the time and assures the department operation. If you have two shifts, if you don't have two shifts, and production ends at 3 o'clock, it's going to be difficult for you to verify conformance specifications at 4 o'clock when nothing's going on. The area manager really, while they are aware of the internal audit coming, I recommend that they don't inform their personnel. You want the personnel to know that, here we go, here's the audit, it's on time, not on time, it's being performed, surprise, so that they think that internal audits can be performed at all times. Some people, unfortunately, require that type of motivation to perform things in certain manners. Others don't. They'll be in compliance all the time. But some people require a little more external challenge, if you will, than others. During the audit, the auditors should meet with the department manager, review the documentation, verify that the documentation is being followed, and review data. So there's 3 steps there. They should absolutely talk with the department personnel. You want to make sure that anyone who can talk to FDA has already spoken with internal auditors. Also, each audit of each subsystem should include any document control implications or any training implications. And training implications. Anyone performing a procedure should be trained on the current revision of that procedure. And any tangential documents, I'll call them, any slightly related documents, you shouldn't stop. When you're performing internal audit, you shouldn't stop at the documents. You should feel free to expand the scope of your internal audit as you see fit. The internal audit report should contain the area audited, when the audit was performed, who performed the audit, any documents, policies, procedures that were verified, and documents that were reviewed to evidence compliance. If you are reviewing a particular assembly procedure, you will also probably review the DHR for several jobs that reflect that assembly procedure. So that's the distinction between verifying the policies or procedures and reviewing documents to evidence compliance. How many discrepancies they were and what they were. And also, I like a comments field, which is, well, you know, it's not a non-compliance, but I saw something I didn't like. Sometimes I see, you know, when it comes to recording of test results, if they're a bit sloppy but legible, I would call that into question. If they're illegible and incomprehensible, that's obviously going to be a discrepancy. In the corrective action request itself, the contents of that should be the information that reflects that when the audit was performed. I like unique identifiers, you know, 14-01, 14-02, so I can refer to the corrective action request by number, especially on my ECO that changes it to reflect corrective action in response to findings during an internal audit. And the nonconformance found. It should be issued to the department manager. I like that level. Supervisor is reasonable too. Director is probably a little more strategic than I like. I like the tactical aspects of issuing it to department manager. And we'll look at car response and closure as we move forward. I like the internal audit cert as a document to give to FDA. Remember, the audit results are not viewable during their inspection, but you need to show them that you have performed an internal audit. So the audit certification states the dates of the audit, who performed the audit, and the area audited, and it states that the audit results were documented, because you have to have documented your audits, in an audit report dated this date. And this is a document that I show, you know, which lists also what area was audited, that I show to the FDA inspectors to serve as objective evidence of performance of an internal audit. I like to have some boilerplate that I've included here. I don't need to read it, but I like to have a non-compliance distribution statement on my audit certification and an awareness statement also. These meet certain requirements and they show that non-compliances were distributed to somebody, and that results, we're committing that results will be discussed at either an audit committee meeting or or management review. Some other boilerplate I like to have: confidentiality statement that we can't just distribute these internal audit reports, where the documents are located, or perhaps what directory that they're filed in, and how long we're going to keep them. Obviously, I've got to account for my record retention, internal and external requirements by stating that in the internal audit report. After the CAR is issued, corrective action request, I want to have the department manager respond with their corrective action plan, when they responded, and when they think they're going to complete that corrective action plan. So I have when they told me what they're going to do, and when they told me, and when they're going to finish it by. Again, what the responsibility is on the lead auditor to determine that this date, the estimated completion date, has come and gone, and you're still not done yet. The lead auditor reviews the CAR, and they're going to look at the proposed actions, how applicable they are to the nonconformance, and what the time frame is. Just as a guideline, I don't even put this in my procedure, but I'm often asked, well, what's timely? And I like to have a 1-month maximum time period, when possible, for completing the corrective action. In a measurable percentage of the internal audit corrective actions, it's lack of training, or misassembly of product, or certain complaints didn't contain some information. It's things that are easily correctable within a reasonable time frame. But that's just a ballpark. I like to assure timeliness whenever possible. If the lead auditor finds the response, the CAR, unacceptable, he or she should go talk about it with the department manager. There's no reason to go over anybody's head at this point. Just talk about what what makes you uncomfortable, and then go ahead and discuss that. If you need to go to a third party, either the audit committee chairperson or the department director, do that. Everyone's got to end up agreeing on what the corrective action is going to be. The lead auditor should then verify the corrective action has been closed after the estimated date, and if not, they've got to solicit a new date from the department manager and make sure that the department manager updates that response. The lead auditor then documents the actual completion date, and they sign that document, the audit report, or the CAR that is, to indicate that they acknowledge that that corrective action report has now been closed. When it comes to overall awareness, certainly by senior executive management, in your management review minutes, make sure you include all this information. The audits that were performed, what areas were performed. If there is any disparity between the audits, the schedule dates, the audit schedule and the dates that the audits were performed, that should be indicated as well. The results of each of the audit, and a summary is fine. You don't need to include each of the CARs. The response timeframes, just a ballpark of how acceptable they were. Part of the responsibility of executive management is to look at the state of the quality system. Sense of urgency and due dates and due date commitments do fall under this area. What the corrective actions were could be in there, and about the corrective action timeframes as well, how long it took to correct these nonconformances. And if anything continues to be open, what they were, are they on schedule, and when are they planned to be completed. This gives a great snapshot to executive management during the management review of the information during your internal audits. Let's switch gears a little now, and we'll spend a few minutes talking about supplier auditing. I like to point to the regulatory requirements internationally to talk about supplier auditing, and how you control. The first bullet point pretty much says that how you control your supplier is based on what you purchase from them, and you're going to evaluate and select suppliers based on their ability to supply product, and how you select and evaluate them must be established, and the results of these evaluations have to be maintained. So this is the regulation, the ISO regulation that enables us, gives us a good starting point on which to jump off of as to develop a supplier auditing program. Looking here domestically, purchasing controls requires that we establish the requirements that our suppliers have to meet. We're going to evaluate them and select them. Those are 2 steps now, based on their ability to meet these requirements. And we're going to determine the type of control that we're going to exercise over them. Very, very similar, if not identical, to the ISO requirements. And we're going to have to keep records of our acceptable suppliers. Just as a point to the last, some firms choose to grade their suppliers. That's not explicitly required, but you've got to have an AVL, an approved vendor, or an ASL, approved supplier list in place. So now that we've seen that the requirements are very similar between international and domestic regulations, we're going to begin our pre-supplier audit assessment. And the first step, and in my opinion the most important step, is don't audit a supplier unless you have to. You should not have a requirement that requires you to perform supplier audits of all of your suppliers. There's no reason for that. I like to limit the reasons for my supplier audits. The first one is an initial one. We're about to select this supplier, and not every supplier, not every new supplier, needs to be audited. Just those suppliers who give me what I'll call critical devices, that if they were to malfunction, maybe they could perhaps result in injury, patient injury, or even worse, or complete system nonconformance. Those are pretty critical parts. Another reason for performing a supplier audit might be a noncompliance. Sure, there weren't that many, but this one noncompliance shut us down for a long time. So it's a business decision to a large extent. Another reason for supplier audit might be bad historical data. You've put together trending on this particular supplier, and you've seen that they're really falling down on the job. They're not doing a good job. So you may perform a supplier audit in response. Another area is you have a particular component or service that they provide you that is critical. Similar to how to determine how to limit your initial supplier audits, you can similarly limit your ongoing or routine supplier audits. As I mentioned earlier, there's nothing that requires us to do it. We are required to assess our suppliers, but not go on site and audit them. Before you perform a supplier audit, please call your supplier and let them know that you intend to perform an audit. I like to let them know why I'm doing this, because I don't want to surprise them. I just want to let them know, you know what, we haven't had that many non-conformances, or perhaps none, but your component is pretty critical to the performance or safety of our device, so we like to do this every year or 2 years. That's easy. Or, you know what, we've had quite a few problems recently, as you're no doubt aware. Please make sure your supplier is aware of their non-conformances. So we'd like to go ahead and make sure we're going to schedule a time when you're going to be there. When I perform supplier audits, I think a day, maybe a day and change, is sufficient. To spend multiple days, or 3 to 4 or 5 days at a supplier site, I'm not really doing anything. I want to focus my supplier audit on our process. Many suppliers supply multiple customers. To a large extent, I don't care. I'm not interested in what they do for other of their customers. I want to watch my process being performed. And I want to be nice about this. The concept of a supplier customer is it's a relationship. You chose that supplier for a reason. Perhaps it was delivery date, cost, quality. And if something's not working out, you want to be cordial about it. You want to continue that relationship. So if you're going to spend money to go perform a supplier audit, thousands of dollars in most cases, then you want to make sure that you're doing this because it's a relationship you want to maintain. So be nice about it. Asking for some documentation in advance, there's nothing wrong with that. I like to ask, and we're often asked here, for our quality manual. Perhaps a couple of documents that may have been modified within the last year or a couple of years, or maybe some governing documents like non-conforming handling, something like that. But when you ask your supplier for documents, don't go overboard. Don't ask for all of the Tier 2 procedures or every procedure in the manufacturing and assembly of all products. If you're only going to spend a finite period of time there, you want to have taken a look at some things in advance because it helps the audit go along. But you don't want to ask for so many documents in advance. I like using a supplier qualification survey, a checklist, when I perform my internal audit. It's not required, but it reminds me to ask all of the pertinent information that I'm going to ask. When you actually are performing the audit, when you get there, make sure that you remind them of why you're there, especially if there's quality issues. You want to let them know, remind them that, again, we want to speak about these particular issues we're having. Don't be too subtle. You don't have time to try to, trap them or, be underhanded. Avoid any subtleties. Don't, tell them what you're there for. You're working together. You're not the FDA. You're not trying to catch them. You want to make sure that they know why you're there, and you want to continue the relationship. Don't overdress. Part of the discussion I like to have with customers I'm auditing, or companies that I'm auditing who supply to us, not customers, sorry about that, suppliers that I'm auditing, is, I'm coming on a Friday. Do you guys have casual Friday? What's the normal dress there? I don't necessarily need to wear a tie and jacket every time I'm performing a supplier audit, because I don't want to be intimidating in my style of dress. Also, during the audit, I like to discuss potential issues. When I'm there up front, again, this usually rears its head during audits that are required due to serious nonconformances or trends of nonconformances. But even if there are just potential issues, if we have a critical part and I want to see that it's being made, perhaps it's a PC board, I want to let them know we may have had bad experience in the past with other suppliers of PC boards. We're very sensitive about it, or it's critical to the operation of our device. So I just want to make sure that you're assembling it and testing it in the manner in which, which suits us. Be outgoing, be friendly. Make sure that your supplier audit team members are those types of people. It's a group. You're in this together. You want to go out to lunch with these people during the day, or even if you bring lunch in. Not on the other hand, but in a somewhat unrelated, yet related, sorry for the confusion, point, remember that, don't be confrontational, but be insistent. You want to see those incoming inspection records. And if they're not there, why aren't they there? Where are they? And if they can't get them to you that day, please, when can you get them to me? You want to see specific records. You're there to see records. If they're not available, that's a potential problem. And you want to make sure that you get them. Don't move on to the next thing. Focus on what you're there for. Just a few comments on interviewing techniques. Talk to anybody you want. You're there because you give them money and they give you product. They want your money and you want their good product. Speak to their assemblers. Don't, feel free to ask to it. It's when they tell you you can't, that's when I have an issue. Somebody can be there while I'm talking to the assembler, let's say, their supervisor, their manager. In some cases, I may ask an assembler a question that they don't know the answer to. And it's okay for the supervisor or manager to step in and respond. I don't have a problem with that at all. Don't force speculation. If you have a potential issue, tell them what the issue is. Don't try to trap them and say, so you mean if you assembled it, if you had this type of nonconformance, you wouldn't document it? Don't do that. Focus on what you're talking about. Jokingly, what I like to tell people is think of your experiences with the FDA and then do the exact opposite. When you review the SOPs, governing SOPs, and the records that illustrate objective conformance to those SOPs, make it a logical conclusion from your audit plan. When you supplied them a plan in advance that you're going to look at, let's say the procedure for nonconforming handling, You're going to look at procedures for non-conforming handling for your products, not for other products. Don't just ask for random documents. Yeah, can I get complaints from 3 months ago? There's no reason for that. You're there for a focused reason. Stay on task. Don't try to trick them or trap them. If you ask for documents and there's some issues of propriety and they won't let you sign a document that, confidentiality agreement, that's okay. Expect that. You're going to note that in the report that, you weren't able to get these non-conforming records due to claimed issues of propriety. It's unfortunate, but it does happen. Don't even ask to take pictures. I've been in situations where I've asked to take pictures and it created a little bit of friction between me and the supplier. There's no reason to ask to take pictures. To say that people at the firm want to see what it's like here, I don't know. I'm not a fan. It's just a recommendation. If you feel that you need to ask to take pictures or you've been directed to ask to take pictures, maybe during the pre-audit planning when you contact the supplier to schedule, maybe that's something you bring up. Afterwards, you're going to write an official audit report. Make sure you get it to them within 1 week. If someone's on vacation, sure, maybe a week and change, but a month later doesn't really do anybody any good. When I prepare a supplier audit report, I like to talk about, again, what brought me there. When I performed the audit, everybody I spoke with in their positions. Then a list of general observations. I looked at this. It sort of complements, if you will. Or at worst, things I was relatively uncomfortable with. I performed a supplier audit recently. I realize I'm a couple of minutes over, but there are not that many more slides. I performed a supplier audit recently where the validation documentation looked good, but wow, it was really difficult to read. It bordered on illegible. So during my observations, I noted that, the particular validation report for these two validations was very difficult to read. It was sloppy, because it was, and I recommended that in the future, they take a little more time to handwrite their documents or type them up. And then noncompliances. Issue noncompliances, we call them CARs, sometimes corrective action requests, individually, one for each finding. I request a root cause investigation and a corrective action, and I work with the supplier to come up with a deadline for a response. I like to do it. I like to require a 30-day response because I remind them I'm not asking for them to complete the corrective action, but I just want them to tell me what they determined was the root cause and what they intend to do to fix it, and then the due date by which they intend to complete that. I also like to make sure that I state any non-compliance related action items. It's not that you're going to have a conclusion, this supplier is good, although I've seen that before. There are some significantly larger firms than mine that rank their suppliers. They grade them 1 through 4, I believe. So they will talk about no action items required. The supplier is a ranking 1. When you, even in your nonconformances, take care to positively paraphrase things. That's why the general observations section is so important to the audit report, because it's all the stuff you liked. When you follow up on the audit, just noncompliances, you want to make sure that, hey, next week the noncompliance response to corrective action request number 3 is due. Just want to give you a reminder and then follow up. If you don't hear the day after it's due, let them know that it was due yesterday. So in summary, and I did promise that we were almost done, during internal audits, make sure that all of your personnel understand that you want them to be completely honest, because this is when you want to catch things. You have to make sure that that senior management and executive management communicates to everybody that if they're not complying, there's going to be no penalty. They're not going to be fired or sanctioned in any way. And I like internal audits a lot because it's kind of a learning experience for the real thing being your ISO notified body audit or your FDA inspection. Supplier audits, the best way to think about a supplier audit is that it's a communication tool. You're there for a reason. What is the reason? When you finish your supplier audit, you supply the report. It's all about communication. You, again, as I said earlier, you won't go perform a supplier audit on a supplier that you want to jettison. Therefore, it's a relationship that you want to maintain, and you're going to do your best to maintain it. Well, that's the end of the presentation, so I think we can open the Q&A right now.
Thank you, Jeff, for the wonderful presentation, and I would also like to thank all participants for cooperating with us. As Jeff mentioned, it's time for the Q&A to begin, and I request all who have questions for our presenter to click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon at the bottom of your participants panel. Now, this is to ask your questions verbally. You can also post in your questions in the Q&A panel so that our presenter can read it out loud and then answer it for you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if for any reason you're unable to ask your questions using either of two means that I just mentioned, you can share your question with me by chat, and I shall pass it on to our presenter to answer it for you. Now, in the meantime, as we're waiting for the questions to come up, I sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that has appeared on your polling panel right now. Now, this feedback has just 8 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and it wouldn't take more than 2 minutes of your time to answer it. Now, this polling would remain open till the end of the session, so you can answer it even after the Q&A is over. Would be grateful if you could stay back a little longer and complete this feedback for us. Ladies and gentlemen, just to confirm again, well, the Q&A session has begun, so I request all who have questions for our presenter to send in your questions, and he can answer it for you. Now, if in case you do come up with any questions even after today's session, you can go ahead and send in your questions to me, and I can pass it on to our presenter to get that answered for you. Okay, Jeff, I do see that there is one question that's coming up from our participant. I'm going to unmute the line so that they will go ahead and ask the question verbally to you.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Jennifer, go ahead with your question.
When you're doing a vendor audit, how do you recommend you handle a situation if you feel that you're being told things that are not true or accurate?
Well, as opposed to asking you what, it's all about interpretation. So I would try to, qualify, with objective evidence that it's not. I mean, you could be wrong in your perception that the statements are inaccurate. So you've got to go ahead and almost lawyerishly, I guess, try to determine what it is you think they're, let's call it lying, because that's what you think is going on.
Right.
So try to get them provide you with documentation that supports their conclusion or your conclusion. Just because it's difficult to put down what someone says to determine compliance. So what you've got to do is just get documentation in your hand, or via email, of course, that answers that question. You've got to reach a determination whether or not they're lying or just perhaps wrong. Is there any way for you to do that?
Sorry, Jeff, I didn't get that.
I'm sorry?
No, go ahead, Jeff.
Right.
I do apologize. Sorry for the interruption. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. So in addition to that, so I had an experience where that was going on, and in requesting interview with people on the project team at the particular vendor, the same individual required presence during all of the interviews, even when it was requested that this person not be present, and was actively answering questions for the interviewee.
Wow. I mean, that's unusual. And I think that you've, unfortunately, trust issues aside, you've got to take what your supplier tells you. I mean, it's a relationship. For whatever reason,
Right.
They don't trust their people to speak. Either they don't think they would understand the question, or they want to provide misleading or inaccurate information. But you've
Right.
got, since it's a relationship, you've got to trust that they're providing you with correct information. whether it's misleading, gray area kind of thing, that could be the issue of interpretation. I would advise also, is this, could you second source this service or material?
It would be challenging at best to make a change. And so just some of the things that you were saying about handling yourself during an inspection was, in this particular scenario, I found myself acting contrary to what you were recommending, and I was just curious if, for example, when you were talking about not kind of tricking people into answers, I found myself in that situation and, indeed, through that process, identified that statements were misleading and not accurate.
What was, what was the purpose of your visit? Was it non-conforming material, or was it to qualify them, or was it because they're a high-risk supplier?
High-risk supplier.
Okay, so the component is critical to the operation or safety of your product. I mean,
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that you go.
Oh, I was going to say it's a little bit different because it's more in terms of clinical trial management. Wow. So, this particular group is the main CRO managing a clinical trial. So it is critical, and it's critical to the company financially, and the integrity of their data is at risk.
Wow. I mean, if they're, so in this situation, if you haven't received any data yet that you consider to be questionable, then you've got to trust that for whatever reason, they don't trust their people, and and just be aware of that. Certainly, you'd want to have safeguards in place to assure that any results you got that seemed to contradict the data you were receiving were elevated. But for the time being, I think that while, your uncomfortableness aside, I think that your uncomfortableness, and based on the fact that it would be very difficult for you to qualify for use another CRO, that you've got to continue to use them until which time you're just not comfortable using them, and then use another one. That's unfortunate.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks for the question, Jennifer. Jeff, I have another question that's come up from our participant. I will go ahead and pass on the question to you through chat so that you could, check on that and then answer it for our participants.
All right, I'll wait to see that.
Thank you. Okay, I just passed on the questions to you.
Okay, I got it. The question reads, for supplier audits, is it okay to send a questionnaire to the supplier on a scheduled basis? Well, that's not an audit. The concept of the audit is you go to the facility and you perform, think about an internal audit. When you perform an internal audit, you go to the department and you interview and you review documents and things like that. A questionnaire is a fully acceptable method of supplier assessment, but not a supplier audit. So the strict answer to the question is, it's not okay to send a questionnaire for a supplier audit because that's not what it is. But the real answer is, since we're not required to perform supplier audits, but merely supplier assessments, it is absolutely acceptable to perform a periodic questionnaire to have the supplier send back.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, I have another question. Shall I go ahead and pass it on to you through chat as well?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is, are auditors required to be certified? For example, can QA personnel audit without being certified auditors? I can't point to a section of either of the regulations, either the ISO or the FDA regs, that require certification for internal auditors. But look at it another way. Would you have somebody assemble your medical device who hasn't been trained on that assembly procedure? Of course not. internal auditing is so critical that it's going to be very difficult for you to justify no external training for your internal auditors. And you don't want to be in the situation where you have to try to justify things. There's plenty of in-person or even online internal auditing training that all of us can afford to have our people perform those, participate in that training. So I would say, are auditors required to be certified? Probably not, but in practicality, can people audit without being certified auditors? I don't see how they would know how to perform an internal audit without having been trained and therefore certified. Any training program you go to for internal auditing will give you a certification. So I absolutely recommend that you externally train / certify all of your internal auditors.
Thank you, Jeff. And ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned earlier, if you still have questions, what you could do is you can go ahead and send in an email to me with your questions, and I can go ahead and pass it on to a presenter to get that answered for you. And I'd also like to inform you that we are all that if you feel that your team members, colleagues might benefit from this webinar, we're happy to inform you that this particular webinar is available in the recorded format, and you can purchase them from our website, or you can call our toll-free number, and you can have access to the recorded version as well. You can see our details on the screen right now. You can also get in touch with me regarding any future webinars, and I can go ahead and answer your queries as well. Okay, and Jeff, before we could conclude today's session, do you have any other thoughts left?
Just that, again, a reminder that you don't need to perform supplier audits. It's not a requirement. You do need to assess your suppliers. Although I can tell you, if you have any auditors in California, perhaps Hawaii, maybe Key West and Florida, you've absolutely have to perform audits of those. I'm just kidding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. And ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful to having you taking part in this webinar. Now, we welcome your suggestions and feedbacks or ideas on how we can improve our webinars. We look forward to having you with us again sometime soon. On behalf of our presenter, Jeff Kassoff, and the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I wish you a pleasant day ahead. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And Jeff, thanks a lot for your time today. You have a wonderful day ahead.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.